At my husband's will reading, my son looked me in the eye and said, "The old ranch is enough for someone like you." I simply nodded. They mistook my silence for surrender. They had no idea the last page of my husband's legacy had not yet been opened. "I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end of my story, and let me know which city you're watching from. It always amazes me how far these stories travel, and reading your comments reminds me that no one should have to face betrayal alone." The conference room smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh coffee. It was the kind of place designed to feel respectable, where quiet voices carried more weight than shouting ever could. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, landing across the long oak table where my family sat waiting for Grant's attorney to begin. Only 9 days had passed since I buried my husband of 38 years. 9 days. People kept telling me time would soften the grief. They meant well, but grief wasn't something that softened. It simply changed its shape. Sometimes it felt like a stone resting quietly inside my chest. Other times it pressed so hard that even breathing seemed like work. I folded my hands in my lap, careful not to let anyone see them tremble. Grant always loved this time of year. Early autumn painted our ranch in shades of gold and copper, and every October he would stand on the porch with a mug of black coffee, insisting the land looked richer after the first cool mornings. Now those fields belonged to memory. Across the table, my son, Evan, adjusted the cuffs of his tailored jacket without looking at me. At 41, he resembled his father more every year. The same broad shoulders, the same gray-blue eyes, but those eyes no longer carried Grant's kindness. Beside him sat my daughter-in-law, Sienna, elegant, perfectly composed. Her charcoal dress looked more appropriate for a corporate meeting than a family gathering. She rested one manicured hand lightly over Evan's wrist, almost as though reminding him when to speak and when to stay quiet. She offered me a polite smile. It never reached her eyes. Clark, Grant's attorney and oldest friend, entered carrying a thick leather folder. I'd known Clark nearly as long as I'd known my husband. We'd celebrated birthdays together, watched our children grow up together, and stood beside each other at more county fairs than I could count. Today he looked older. Not because of the gray in his hair, because of the sadness in his eyes. "My deepest condolences again, Nora," he said quietly. "Thank you, Clark." His gaze lingered on me for a brief moment, almost as if he wanted to say something more. Instead, he sat down and opened the folder. "The purpose of today's meeting," he began, "is to review Grant Ashford's final estate documents." The room fell silent. Outside, a distant tractor hummed somewhere beyond the courthouse lawn. Inside, no one moved. Clark started with routine matters: savings accounts, insurance policies, equipment, investments. Every few minutes, Sienna leaned toward Evan and whispered something that made him nod almost automatically. I noticed everything. Grief has a strange way of sharpening your vision. Once you've lost the person who loved you most, you begin seeing everyone else exactly as they are. Then Clark paused. "There remains the matter of the ranch." Sienna straightened almost imperceptibly. Evan finally looked directly at me. For the first time that morning, he sighed as though preparing himself for an uncomfortable conversation. "Mom," he said, forcing a smile that felt practiced rather than sincere, "I think Dad would have wanted everyone to be practical." Practical. Such an innocent word, until people use it to justify cruelty. "The ranch is old," he continued. "It needs expensive maintenance. It's isolated. Honestly," he glanced toward Sienna before finishing, "it's enough for someone like you." The sentence landed harder than any shout could have. Someone like you. Not my mother. Not Dad's wife. Just someone like you. No one corrected him. No one gasped. Even the air seemed to stop moving. I slowly lifted my eyes to meet his. He expected tears, an argument, maybe even pleading. Instead, I smiled, a small one, barely enough to move the corners of my mouth. "I see," I answered softly. Sienna relaxed in her chair. Evan looked relieved. They thought the conversation was over. They believed I'd accepted my place. Across the table, however, Clark didn't move. His fingers remained resting on a sealed ivory envelope tucked beneath the estate papers. His expression had changed, not with surprise, with hesitation, as though he were waiting for exactly this moment. And somehow, I suddenly knew Grant's story wasn't finished yet. The ivory envelope stayed exactly where it was. Clark didn't reach for it. Not yet. Instead, he calmly closed the folder in front of him and adjusted his glasses. There are still several procedural matters we need to complete, he said in his usual measured voice. Sienna leaned back with visible relief. I noticed the faint smile that crossed her face before she quickly hid it behind professional sympathy. If someone had walked into the room at that moment, they would have thought she was a loving daughter-in-law worried about an aging widow. Appearances can be remarkably convincing, especially when someone has spent years practicing them. Evan gathered a few papers from the table and looked toward me again. You'll like the ranch, Mom. His voice was softer now, almost reassuring. It's quiet out there. Quiet. I almost smiled again. Grant and I had spent nearly 4 decades turning that ranch into a home. Every fence post, every maple tree lining the gravel driveway, every weathered barn board carried memories of our life together. Quiet wasn't the word I would have chosen. Alive was. I remembered spring mornings when Grant would leave before sunrise to check the cattle while I prepared breakfast. By the time he came back into the kitchen, his boots were covered with mud, and his jacket smelled of fresh hay and cold air. He always kissed my forehead before pouring himself another cup of coffee. Best office in America, he'd say, looking out the kitchen window toward the fields. I'd laugh every single time. Those mornings felt impossibly far away now. Clark continued explaining legal timelines, but his words faded into the background as another memory surfaced. Grant had never treated the ranch like property. He called it our promise. Whenever friends suggested selling after land prices increased, he would shake his head. This place isn't our investment, he'd tell them. It's our family. Back then, Evan understood that. As a little boy, he loved riding beside his father in the old pickup truck. He could barely see over the dashboard, yet he insisted on helping feed the horses every Saturday morning. He knew every trail across the property. He knew the names of every old oak tree. He once cried for an hour after a storm knocked down one of Grant's favorite apple trees. Sometimes I wonder exactly when children stop remembering where they came from. Or perhaps they don't forget. Perhaps they simply decide something else matters more. That thought stayed with me as everyone stood from the conference table. Sienna was already discussing renovation ideas with Evan, in a voice she clearly assumed I couldn't hear. The acreage alone is worth a fortune, she whispered. We could divide the north field into luxury lots. Evan hesitated. For now, maybe. She touched his arm. No, not maybe. We've talked about this. It makes financial sense. Financial sense. There was that phrase again. People often use numbers to silence memories. Grant never did. To him, value wasn't measured only by market prices. It was measured by birthdays celebrated on the porch, Christmas mornings around the stone fireplace, summer evenings watching fireflies appear over the pasture, the first colt born each spring, the swing he'd built when Evan was 6, the bench he'd built for me after our 25th anniversary. None of those things appeared on financial statements. But they were the richest parts of our lives. As Clark organized his documents, he looked toward me for only a second. It wasn't a long glance. Most people wouldn't have noticed it. I did. There was concern in his eyes. And something else. Patience. Almost as though he wanted me to keep listening before reaching any conclusions. The courthouse hallway outside the conference room echoed with distant footsteps as another family arrived for a different appointment. Life continued moving for everyone else. Mine had stopped 9 days earlier. Sienna picked up her designer handbag and smiled brightly. I know today has been emotional, Nora. Her voice sounded gentle, too gentle. But I think this is really a fresh start. A fresh start. Interesting choice of words. Fresh for whom? For the woman who had just buried her husband? Or for the people already planning what to do with everything he had spent a lifetime building? I met her eyes. She held my gaze confidently. She believed she'd already won. Years ago, that confidence might have intimidated me. Not anymore. Loss changes people. When you've survived the hardest goodbye of your life, smaller fears lose their power. Evan reached for my coat hanging beside the door. I'll drive you home. I brought my own truck, I answered quietly. He looked surprised. You shouldn't be driving alone. I've been driving those country roads longer than you've been alive. He gave an awkward smile but didn't argue. For a brief moment, I saw a flicker of the little boy he used to be. Then Sienna called his name. The moment disappeared. Clark walked with me toward the hallway. Neither of us spoke until we were out of earshot. He stopped beside one of the courthouse windows overlooking the parking lot. The afternoon sun reflected across the glass. Nora, he said carefully, there are still a few things we need to discuss. I looked at him without saying a word. He lowered his voice. Grant trusted me with every detail. His hand rested lightly on the leather folder he was still carrying. I only ask one thing. What is it? Don't make any decisions today. For the first time since entering that conference room, I felt something shift inside me. Not hope, not yet, but certainty. Grant had always planned 3 steps ahead. If Clark was asking me to wait, there had to be a reason. And somehow, I knew the story my son believed had already ended was only just beginning. I stood beside my truck for several minutes after Clark went back inside. The courthouse parking lot was nearly empty, the afternoon sun stretching long shadows across the pavement. Somewhere nearby, a flag snapped gently in the breeze. Cars came and went. People laughed as they walked down the sidewalk. The world hadn't changed, mine had. I rested both hands on the steering wheel before starting the engine. For the first time in 38 years, I was driving home alone, knowing Grant would never be waiting for me. That realization never became easier. Every morning I still reached across the bed expecting to find him there. Every evening I caught myself listening for the sound of his boots on the porch. Grief is strange like that. It doesn't ask permission before reminding you of what you've lost. The drive back to the ranch took a little over 40 minutes. Every mile carried a memory. The old red grain elevator where Grant once stopped to help a stranded family change a tire. The little diner where we'd celebrated every wedding anniversary with pie, because he insisted expensive restaurants never tasted as good as homemade food. The narrow bridge where Evan had begged his father to let him drive the pickup when he was only 12. Grant laughed so hard that day he nearly spilled his coffee. "You'll drive someday," he'd told him, "but not until your feet can reach the pedals." Evan had pouted all afternoon. By dinner, he was laughing again. Back then, disappointment never lasted long. Somewhere along the road to adulthood, something inside him had changed. Or maybe someone had changed it. The ranch came into view just before sunset. The white wooden fence stretched across the rolling pasture exactly as it had for decades. The weathered red barn stood proudly against the golden hills, while the wraparound porch caught the last light of the day. Most people would have seen an aging property. Grant always saw home. I parked beside the barn instead of the house. For a long moment, I simply sat there. Silence surrounded me. Not an empty silence. A familiar one. The kind filled with rustling leaves, distant cattle, and the wind moving through tall grass. Grant used to say the ranch had its own heartbeat. Standing there, I almost believed I could still hear it. I stepped out and slowly walked toward the porch. The porch swing moved gently with the breeze. Grant had built it during one rainy weekend nearly 15 years ago. He claimed every farmhouse deserved a proper porch swing. "It'll outlast both of us," he joked while tightening the last bolt. He wasn't wrong. My fingers brushed across the worn wood before I unlocked the front door. Inside, everything remained exactly where we'd left it. His favorite hat still hung beside the back entrance. A pair of work gloves rested on the kitchen counter. His reading glasses sat next to yesterday's newspaper. I hadn't moved any of it. Not because I couldn't, because I wasn't ready. The house still smelled faintly of cedarwood, coffee, and the leather conditioner Grant used on his boots. It was amazing how ordinary things could keep a person alive inside your heart. I walked into the kitchen and automatically reached for 2 coffee mugs. Halfway through, I stopped. There was only one of us now. I quietly returned the second mug to the cabinet. As the coffee brewed, my eyes wandered toward the bulletin board near the refrigerator. Dozens of photographs covered it. There was Evan at 8 years old, proudly holding the first fish he'd ever caught with Grant. Another showed him standing in oversized cowboy boots during his first county fair. Then there was one of all 3 of us sitting on the porch after repainting the barn together. We looked exhausted and unbelievably happy. I picked up the photograph. "What happened to us?" I whispered. The house offered no answer, only silence. A knock at the back door startled me. I opened it to find Mavis standing there with a casserole dish wrapped in a faded blue towel. She'd worked alongside Grant for almost 3 decades, managing everything from bookkeeping to harvest schedules. More importantly, she'd become family. "I figured you hadn't eaten," she said gently. "You figured right." She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, the way she'd done hundreds of times before. "I made chicken pot pie, Grant's favorite." I smiled faintly. "He always said yours was better than mine." She laughed. "He only told me that because he knew you'd hear about it." For the first time all day, I laughed too. It lasted only a second, but it felt good. We sat at the kitchen table in comfortable silence before Mavis finally spoke. How did it go? I stirred my untouched coffee. They're already talking about selling pieces of the ranch. She didn't seem surprised. I thought they might. You knew? I suspected. She folded her hands together. Sienna has been asking questions for months. What kind of questions? Property taxes, boundary lines, water rights, how quickly equipment could be appraised. Each answer settled heavily inside my chest. So it started before Grant died. Mavis nodded slowly. I believe so. Neither of us spoke for a while. Outside, the last light faded behind the hills. Finally, she reached into her purse. I wasn't sure whether to give this to you today. She placed a small brass key on the table between us. I frowned. What is this? I found it in Grant's workshop the morning after. Her voice trailed off. It had your name attached. I turned the tiny key over in my hand. A faded paper tag was tied around it with old twine. In Grant's unmistakable handwriting were only 4 words. For Nora. When ready. I stared at the message. Grant had never done anything without a reason. I looked back at Mavis. Did he ever tell you what it opens? She slowly shook her head. No. But he did tell me one thing. What was that? If the day ever came when you felt completely alone, tell Nora to trust what I left behind. The little brass key suddenly felt much heavier than it looked. And for the first time since the will reading, I realized the sealed envelope wasn't the only secret my husband had been protecting. I sat in Grant's workshop until the morning light slowly filled the room. The leather journal rested on my lap, unopened. For nearly 40 years, my husband had never kept secrets from me. We had shared every bank statement, every difficult harvest, every sleepless night when bills piled higher than we thought we could manage. If he had written this journal without showing it to me, he must have believed one day I would need it more than he would. I took a slow breath and opened the first page. Grant's handwriting looked exactly as I remembered. Steady, neat, and impossible to mistake. The first sentence made me stop. This is not a diary. This is a record. I read it again. Not a diary, a record. Immediately, I understood the difference. Grant wasn't writing about his feelings. He was documenting facts, dates, conversations, decisions, things he believed might matter someday. The first several pages were ordinary. Repairs to the irrigation system, property tax payments, equipment purchases, notes about neighboring ranches. Exactly the sort of careful records Grant had always kept. Then I reached an entry dated almost 2 years earlier. Sienna asked whether the north pasture could be divided into residential lots. I told her this ranch wasn't built to become a subdivision. She smiled, but her disappointment was obvious. I frowned. Grant had never mentioned that conversation. I turned another page. Evan asked how quickly inherited farmland could be sold after probate. Strange question. He claimed he was simply curious. Another page. Sienna suggested that Nora and I should think about retiring somewhere smaller. She said the ranch was becoming too much for us. I lowered the journal. Those conversations had happened while Grant was still healthy, long before anyone knew his heart would fail. They hadn't been planning after his death. They had been planning during his life. A cold feeling settled deep inside me. I continued reading. Every entry was calm. Grant never accused anyone. He simply wrote what happened. The exact words. The dates. Who had been present. It sounded exactly like the man I had married. Fair. Patient. Careful. One particular entry caught my attention. Today I overheard Sienna telling Evan that memories don't increase property values. I closed my eyes. That sentence? I'd heard something almost identical at the attorney's office. The ranch is old. It makes financial sense. Different words. The same belief. Grant had recognized it long before I did. I looked around the workshop. How many evenings had he come out here after dinner, writing quietly while I assumed he was repairing tools? The answer was sitting in my hands. He wasn't hiding from me. He was protecting me. Several pages later, another name appeared. Clark. Met Clark this afternoon. Asked him several legal questions regarding conditional inheritance. He agreed to prepare additional documents if necessary. Conditional inheritance. The phrase echoed inside my mind. Additional documents. Was that what remained inside the sealed envelope? I kept reading. The next entry mentioned Hugh. Hugh thinks I'm worrying too much. I hope he's right. Another. Asked Mavis to continue watching the bookkeeping after I'm gone. She notices details most people overlook. I smiled sadly. Grant hadn't chosen his closest friends because they agreed with him. He chose them because they paid attention. just like he did. As I turned another page, something folded inside the journal slipped onto the workbench. A receipt. Not from a bank. From a safety deposit box at the First County Bank. I picked it up carefully. Grant had rented it less than 6 months before his death. Written beneath the account number was another familiar note. Only if Clark says it's time. Again, he was asking me to wait. Grant had spent his entire life making decisions with patience. Perhaps this final lesson required the same. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. The workshop door stood slightly open. Hugh leaned inside, removing his hat as soon as he saw me. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all." He stepped inside slowly, his weathered boots leaving faint tracks across the wooden floor. "I saw your truck outside. I figured you might be here." I nodded toward the chair across from me. He sat down without saying anything for a while. That was something I always appreciated about Hugh. He never filled silence simply because it existed. Finally, he spoke. "Grant spent a lot of evenings out here during the past year." "I know. He ever tell you why?" I held up the journal. "I think I'm finding out." Hugh's eyes rested on the worn leather cover. "So, he left it." "He did." A faint smile crossed Hugh's face. "He hoped you'd never have to read it." Neither of us said anything for several seconds. Then Hugh sighed. "Your husband wasn't afraid of dying." "I know. He was afraid of leaving you surrounded by people who loved the ranch more than they loved you." The words settled quietly between us. Not dramatic, not angry, simply true. I looked back down at the journal. I keep wondering when he realized something was wrong. Hugh answered almost immediately. The day he stopped believing every smile was honest. Outside, the wind stirred through the oak trees surrounding the workshop. Inside, I turned another page. Tucked carefully between the next 2 entries was a single folded sheet of paper. Across the front, in Grant's unmistakable handwriting, were 6 words that made my heart begin to race. "Open only after the will reading." I stared at the folded sheet for what felt like several minutes. "Open only after the will reading." Grant had written those words knowing there would come a day when I would sit alone in his workshop, searching for answers he could no longer give me in person. My hands hesitated, not because I was afraid of what I might find, because opening that paper felt like saying goodbye to another piece of him. Hugh remained quietly seated across the room. He never asked what the note said. He simply waited. Finally, I unfolded the paper. It wasn't long. Grant had always believed that if something mattered, it didn't need many words. "Nora, if you've reached this page, then you've already heard things that no husband ever wants his wife to hear. I'm sorry I wasn't there to answer them myself." My vision blurred for a moment. I took a slow breath and continued. "You may be wondering why I didn't confront anyone while I was alive. The answer is simple. I wasn't interested in winning arguments. I wanted the truth to reveal itself." That sounded exactly like Grant. He had never believed people truly showed their character when life was easy. Pressure revealed everything. A difficult harvest, financial hardship, illness, inheritance. Those moments exposed who people really were. I kept reading. If Evan still has kindness in his heart, he will find his way back. If he doesn't, no amount of money will save him. I closed my eyes. Grant hadn't written those words with anger. There wasn't a trace of bitterness, only sadness. The sadness of a father who had watched his son slowly become someone he no longer recognized. Hugh quietly stood and walked toward the workshop window. "I remember the day he wrote that," he said without turning around. "You do?" "He came to my place after meeting with Clark. He didn't say much." "What did he say?" Hugh looked out across the pasture before answering. "He said something had changed in Evan. He couldn't explain it, but he could feel it." That sounded like Grant, too. He trusted instinct almost as much as evidence. Many people mistake quiet people for people who don't notice anything. Grant noticed everything. The paper continued. "Don't hate our son. Hate makes honest people become strangers to themselves. But don't ignore what he chooses either. Love without wisdom becomes permission." I lowered the page. Grant wasn't asking me to forgive blindly. He was asking me to remain fair. That had always been his way. When neighbors argued over fences, Grant listened before speaking. When ranch hands made mistakes, he corrected them without humiliating them. Even when people disappointed him, he refused to let resentment make his decisions. I wondered if I was strong enough to do the same. My husband seemed to believe I was. Near the bottom of the page, another paragraph caught my attention. "There is one final document. Clark knows where it is. He also knows when to reveal it. Do not ask him for it. If the time is right, he will come to you. Again. Patience. Grant had built his final plan around timing instead of emotion. I carefully folded the paper and slipped it back inside the journal. Hugh turned toward me. Did it answer your questions? It answered some, and created new ones. He smiled faintly. That sounds like Grant. We both laughed softly. The laughter faded almost as quickly as it came. Outside, clouds had begun gathering over the western hills. The wind carried the smell of approaching rain through the open workshop door. Hugh picked up his hat. I should head back. Before leaving, he stopped beside the workbench. There's something I never told you. I looked up. About 6 months ago, Grant asked me a strange question. What was it? He asked whether I'd still help you if people started treating you differently after he was gone. I felt my throat tighten. What did you tell him? I told him I wouldn't be helping you. He paused just long enough for me to look surprised. Because friends don't help. They stand beside each other. That's different. Emotion caught me off guard. For the first time since Grant's funeral, I didn't feel completely alone. After Hugh left, I remained in the workshop organizing everything back into the cabinet exactly as I'd found it. The journal, the letter, the folders, the small brass key. Nothing felt random anymore. Grant had built this collection carefully. Each piece led naturally to the next. Not to overwhelm me, to prepare me. As I closed the cabinet, my phone vibrated inside my jacket pocket. The screen showed Evan's name. He rarely called first. I answered. Hello. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. Mom, I wanted to let you know. Sienna and I are coming by tomorrow. For what? We've been talking. I think it's time to discuss putting the ranch on the market. He said it so casually, as though we were discussing grocery shopping. Not the home where his father had poured nearly 40 years of his life. I glanced across the workshop toward Grant's empty chair. Just 24 hours earlier, those words would have shattered me. Now, they sounded different. Not because they hurt less, but because I finally understood something. Grant hadn't spent his final months preparing me to argue with our son. He had prepared me to recognize the truth without being blinded by grief. Evan, I said calmly, I don't think tomorrow is the right day. There was a brief silence. Then Sienna's voice drifted through the phone in the background. What did she say? Evan covered the receiver for a moment before answering. She said tomorrow isn't a good day. Another muffled whisper. Then he came back. Well, we'll talk soon. I'm sure we will. The call ended. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. Outside, the first drops of rain began tapping softly against the workshop roof. I looked once more at the cabinet Grant had left behind. Then I quietly turned off the lights. Because deep inside, I knew the next conversation with Evan and Sienna wouldn't be about selling the ranch. It would be the first time they realized I was no longer the grieving widow they believed they could so easily persuade. The next morning arrived with clear skies, as though the storm from the night before had never happened. I woke before sunrise, something Grant had always teased me about. You only beat me out of bed when you're worried, he'd say with a grin. Maybe he had been right. I wasn't worried anymore. Not in the same way. Grief was still there. I doubted it would ever leave completely. But somewhere between the will reading, the journal, and the letters Grant had left behind, another feeling had quietly taken its place. Clarity. I brewed a pot of coffee and carried my mug onto the front porch. The ranch stretched before me, glowing beneath the first light of morning. Dew shimmered across the pasture like scattered glass. A few horses grazed near the eastern fence, completely unaware that people sitting in offices miles away might see this place as nothing more than numbers on paper. Grant never measured life that way. Neither would I. Around 9 o'clock, I heard the sound of a familiar SUV turning onto the gravel driveway. Right on time. Evan climbed out first. Sienna followed a moment later, dressed as though she were meeting real estate investors instead of visiting her late father-in-law's home. She carried a leather portfolio tucked neatly beneath her arm. That told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a family visit. It was a business meeting. I met them on the porch before they reached the front steps. Good morning, I said. Morning, Mom, Evan replied. Sienna smiled politely. Nora, you look well. I slept better than I expected. I'm glad to hear that. She sounded pleased, not relieved. There is a difference. We walked inside together. The kitchen felt strangely unfamiliar with the three of us standing there. Grant used to fill every room simply by being present. Now the silence belonged to someone else. Sienna placed her portfolio on the table before anyone sat down. We don't want to take too much of your time. I'm retired, I answered calmly. I have plenty of time. For the first time, I noticed a tiny flicker of impatience cross her face. Only for a second. Then it disappeared. Evan cleared his throat. Mom, I know everything has happened very fast, but we need to start making practical decisions. There was that word again, practical. I poured coffee into 3 mugs without asking whether anyone wanted any. It gave me a moment to think. Years ago, I probably would have rushed to fill every silence. Now I simply waited. Eventually, people tell you exactly what they're thinking. Sienna opened the portfolio. Inside were several printed documents, color photographs, maps, property estimates. She slid one page across the table toward me. We spoke with a land consultant. I looked down. A glossy aerial photograph of our ranch filled the page. Across the north pasture, someone had drawn neat red lines dividing the land into dozens of rectangular lots. The pasture where Grant had taught Evan to ride horses. The field where Lena chased butterflies every summer. The hill where Grant scattered wildflower seeds because he liked seeing color from the porch. Reduced to boxes, measurements, profit projections. Sienna pointed toward the page. Developers are very interested in this section. I didn't answer. She continued. The location is ideal. The market is strong. If we move quickly. I gently raised one hand. She stopped speaking. I have a question. Of course. When did you have time to prepare all of this? The room became very quiet. Evan shifted uncomfortably. Sienna answered first. We've been researching for a while. How long? She hesitated. A few months. I looked at Evan. He lowered his eyes. Not a few weeks. Not after Grant's funeral. Months. Exactly as Grant's journal had quietly documented. I nodded once. I appreciate your honesty. Neither of them noticed the way I had phrased that sentence. I hadn't thanked them for the proposal. I'd thanked them for confirming what Grant already knew. Sienna mistook my calmness for agreement. She smiled again. So, would you like me to explain the financial projections? No. She looked surprised. I already understand them. You do? I understand that someone has spent a great deal of time calculating what this land is worth. I rested my hand lightly on the photograph. But I haven't heard anyone calculate what this home is worth. Neither of them answered. After several seconds, Evan spoke. Dad would have wanted you to be comfortable. I met his eyes. Your father was comfortable here. He loved this ranch. That's different, Mom. No, I replied quietly. It isn't. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything either of us could have said. Finally, Sienna gathered the papers into a neat stack. We're only trying to help. I know. She blinked. You do? I know exactly what you're trying to do. For the first time since arriving, her confidence slipped. Only slightly, but enough for me to notice. She searched my face, perhaps expecting anger or tears. Instead, I simply stood and walked toward the kitchen window. Outside, the old oak tree beside the barn swayed gently in the breeze. Grant had planted it the year Evan was born. He said he wanted his son to grow up alongside something that would outlive both of them. I wondered what Grant would think if he could see this conversation. Perhaps he already had. Without turning around, I spoke softly. I won't be signing anything today. Evan let out a frustrated breath. Mom. No. Not loudly, not harshly, just one word. The first firm word I'd spoken since Grant's funeral. It seemed to surprise all 3 of us. Sienna slowly closed her portfolio. I understand you need more time. I turned back toward them. You're right. I do. But not to think about selling. I paused. I need time to finish reading everything your father left behind. The color drained from Evan's face. Sienna's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. What do you mean? She asked. I offered the same small smile I had given them at the attorney's office. The truth has a way of arriving one page at a time. Neither of them said another word. As they walked back toward the driveway a few minutes later, I stood quietly on the porch, watching their SUV disappear beyond the front gate. Only after the dust settled did I notice another vehicle slowly turning into the lane. It was Clark, and judging by the thick document case resting on the passenger seat, he hadn't come for coffee. Clark stepped out of his sedan carrying the same weathered leather case I'd seen at the will reading. This time, however, there was no conference room, no polished table, no audience, just the quiet ranch Grant had loved more than any office building in the world. He walked toward the porch, removed his hat, and smiled gently. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all. I was expecting you. I believe Grant thought you might be. That answer didn't surprise me anymore. Over the past 2 days, I'd realized my husband had planned nearly everything except one thing: how much I would miss him. I invited Clark inside. The coffee was still warm, so I poured him a cup without asking. He accepted it with a grateful nod before placing the leather case on the kitchen table. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Grant had always said that important conversations should never be rushed. Clark finally broke the silence. How much have you read? The journal, the letters, and the note he told me to open after the will reading. Clark slowly nodded. Then it's time. He unlocked the brass clasps on the leather case and carefully removed a sealed document wrapped inside a dark blue folder. I recognized Grant's signature immediately. So did my heart. Clark rested one hand on the folder. Grant instructed me to release this only if 2 conditions were met. What conditions? The first, the will reading had to be completed. I nodded. And the second? He looked directly into my eyes. You had to reach your own conclusions before seeing this. I thought about the journal, the conversations Grant had recorded, the property maps Sienna had brought, the eagerness to sell, the months of planning. Grant hadn't wanted someone else to convince me. He wanted me to recognize the truth myself. Clark slid the folder toward me. This is called a statement of intent. It isn't a new will. It doesn't replace any legal document. So what does it do? It explains why Grant structured his estate the way he did. I opened the folder carefully. Inside were several typed pages. The first paragraph was addressed directly to anyone responsible for administering his estate. Then came Grant's own words. If you are reading this, then my family is likely facing difficult decisions. My wife, Nora, has never cared about wealth. She cares about people, promises, and keeping our family together. Please remember that every decision I made was intended to protect those values. I smiled through tears. That was exactly who Grant had always believed I was. Clark waited quietly while I continued reading. Several paragraphs later, another passage caught my attention. Many people will assume the ranch is simply my largest financial asset. It is not. It is the foundation upon which every other part of our family's life was built. Anyone who sees only its market value has already misunderstood its purpose. Those words echoed almost perfectly against everything Sienna had said only an hour earlier. Developers, property values, profit. Grant had anticipated that conversation long before it happened. I turned another page. Near the bottom was something unexpected. A handwritten sentence added after the document had been typed. Clark, if Nora is reading this with the same calm smile she wears whenever she's hiding her strength, tell her I knew she'd be all right. I couldn't help laughing through my tears. He knew me too well. Clark smiled. Yes, he did. We sat quietly for a while before I looked up. There's still something I don't understand. What is it? Why did Grant let the original will be read first? Clark folded his hands together. Because he believed character should reveal itself naturally. He didn't want anyone judged by suspicion. He wanted them judged by their own choices. I thought back to Evan's words. The ranch is enough for someone like you. No one had forced him to say that. Sienna hadn't spoken for him. Those words belonged to him. His father had wanted the truth to come from Evan himself. Clark continued. Grant once told me something I'll never forget. What was it? He said, if my son still remembers the values we taught him, nothing I've prepared will ever be needed. Clark paused before adding quietly, but if he forgets, documents won't destroy him. His own decisions will. The room fell silent again. Outside, I could hear the familiar sound of cattle moving across the pasture. Life on the ranch continued exactly as it always had. Only the people had changed. Clark carefully returned the remaining papers to the folder. There are still legal matters we haven't discussed. I assumed there were. There is one final meeting scheduled for Friday, with Evan and Sienna present. I looked at him. They don't know? He slowly shook his head. No. They believe everything was settled during the first reading. A quiet understanding settled between us. Friday wasn't going to be another argument. It wasn't going to be about revenge. It was simply going to be the day every choice, every word, and every intention would finally stand beside the truth. As Clark prepared to leave, he paused at the front door. Oh, one more thing. What is it? He smiled in the same calm way Grant used to. Bring Grant's journal with you. They're going to need to understand that he saw far more than any of them ever imagined. Friday arrived with a clear blue sky. Grant used to say that the weather never cared whether people were celebrating or grieving. The sun rose just the same. I stood on the front porch for a long moment before leaving the ranch. The journal rested inside my leather bag. So did the handwritten letters, the small brass key, and every quiet lesson Grant had left behind. Before locking the front door, I looked across the pasture one more time. The horses wandered peacefully near the old oak tree Grant had planted when Evan was born. The porch swing moved gently in the morning breeze, just as it had every evening for the past 15 years. Nothing about the ranch had changed, only the people standing to inherit it. When I arrived at Clark's office, Evan and Sienna were already there. Neither of them expected to see me carrying anything besides my purse. Sienna smiled politely. "Good morning, Nora." "Good morning." Evan pulled out a chair for me. It reminded me of the little boy who used to insist on carrying my grocery bags because he wanted to help. For just a second, I wondered whether that boy still existed somewhere beneath the man sitting across from me. Clark entered carrying several folders. Unlike the first meeting, there was no tension in his voice, only quiet professionalism. "Thank you all for coming." Everyone took their seats. Clark looked toward Evan first. Following the initial reading of Grant's will, there remained one final instruction that could only be addressed after sufficient time had passed. Sienna frowned slightly. "I thought everything had already been finalized." "So did I," Evan added. Clark nodded. "That was intentional." He opened the dark blue folder. Grant believed that certain truths should be understood only after people had revealed themselves through their own choices. No one spoke. Clark continued. "Over the past several days, Nora has reviewed the documents Grant prepared privately before his passing." Sienna glanced toward me. For the first time since Grant's funeral, I saw uncertainty in her expression. Not fear, not yet, only uncertainty. Clark picked up a typed page. "This is Grant's statement of intent." He began reading. Grant's words filled the room once again. Not angry, not accusatory, simply honest. He wrote about the years Nora and he spent building the ranch together. He wrote that the property represented commitment rather than wealth. He explained that preserving the ranch mattered only if the people caring for it also preserved the values that built it. Then Clark reached the final page. "This section," he said quietly, "was to be shared only after the first reading." He looked directly at Evan. Grant wrote, "If my son chooses compassion over convenience, then everything I feared was unnecessary. But if he chooses profit before family," Clark paused, "then I leave my complete confidence in Nora's judgment." Silence settled across the room. I looked toward Evan. His face had lost its color. He wasn't looking at Clark. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the table. Clark continued. "Grant also transferred full decision-making authority regarding the ranch to Nora." Sienna immediately leaned forward. "What does that mean?" "It means," Clark answered calmly, "no portion of the ranch may be sold, divided, or developed without Nora's written approval." She blinked. "But the will remains valid. This document explains Grant's legal intent and activates the authority he established through the estate structure." For the first time, Sienna had nothing to say. The room grew very still. I slowly opened my leather bag and removed Grant's journal. Without speaking, I placed it gently on the table. Evan looked at it. "What is that?" "Your father's journal." His eyes lifted toward mine. "He kept a journal?" "It isn't a diary." I smiled softly. "It's a record." I turned the journal around so he could see the pages. "I've read every word. I won't ask you to believe me. I'll ask you to read your father's own handwriting." Evan hesitated before reaching for it. His hands trembled slightly. As he turned the first few pages, I watched his expression slowly change. Confusion, recognition, regret. He reached the entry describing the conversation about selling the north pasture, then another, then another. Finally, he stopped reading. His shoulders sank. "I didn't know he wrote all this." "No," I answered gently. "You didn't." A long silence followed. Eventually, Evan looked up. There were tears in his eyes. Not loud tears, the quiet kind that arrive when excuses finally disappear. "I'm sorry, Mom." 3 simple words. Words I had wanted to hear. Words that came too late to erase the past, but not too late to change the future. I reached across the table and rested my hand over his. "I lost your father. I don't want to lose my son too." He lowered his head. "I'm ashamed." "I know." Sienna remained completely silent. For the first time since I'd met her, she wasn't leading the conversation. She wasn't calculating. She wasn't persuading. She simply sat there, confronted by the truth that Grant had quietly prepared years before. As the meeting ended, Clark gathered the legal documents while Evan carefully held onto the journal. "I'd like to borrow this," he asked. I nodded. "Take your time. It took your father years to write." Outside the courthouse, we stood together for a moment, before going our separate ways. The afternoon breeze carried the familiar scent of freshly cut hay from somewhere beyond town. It reminded me of home. Later that evening, I returned to the ranch alone. The porch swing was waiting, just as it always had. I sat down with a cup of coffee and watched the sun disappear behind the western hills. Golden light spread across the fields Grant had loved with all his heart. I could almost hear his voice beside me. "We were never raising land, Nora. We were raising a family. Some families inherit property, some inherit money. The greatest inheritance Grant left behind wasn't written inside a will. It was the reminder that character always outlives wealth." The ranch remained exactly where it had always been, and so did the promise we built together. This time, it was my turn to protect it. Looking back now, I realize that an inheritance is never just about land, money, or a name written on a legal document. It's about the values we choose to protect when no one is watching. Grant didn't leave me the ranch because he believed I was the strongest. He left it to me because he knew I would never confuse its price with its worth. And if my story reminds you of anything, I hope it's this. Never let someone else's greed convince you that your lifetime of love, sacrifice, and integrity is worth less than what can be bought or sold.